Hello and welcome to your recap of the EPT European Weekly number 131. If you enjoyed the video, please remember to hit subscribe, and if you think of any games that you feel like I missed out that were really great, be sure to leave them in a comment down below. With that out of the way, let's get started. The early rounds progressed as per usual with no real major upsets. Denver did face off versus Disc fairly early on in the round of 64 and took a 2-0 there, but outside of that, it was pretty much business as usual. The round of 32 was also pretty straightforward, with the only interesting match really being Strange versus Mana, where Strange ended up taking the series 2-0. Outside of that, everything pretty much progressed as you would expect. The round of 16 is where things started getting interesting though. MaxPax faced off against a Laser, and while MaxPax was unable to attend DreamHack Valencia, a Laser was coming in hot off his top 12 finish at DreamHack Valencia. MaxPax and a Laser both did the hot thing in PvZ these days, which is lots of low-tech units off the back of a killer economy. But MaxPax just ended up handling things a little bit better, was able to shut down the 5th base attempts from a Laser for so long that he was able to eventually secure an economic lead and take the series 2-0. Some of the other round of 16 matches worth mentioning were Hearthstone taking a 2-0 versus Showtime, Kelazur taking a 2-1 versus Estrella, and Trigger, while not beating Clem, was able to take a map off of him, which to me is pretty damn impressive. Heading into the quarterfinals, I got to see Neeb versus Kelazur, which ended up being a surprisingly good series. Game number 1 was the antithesis of a good game though, as we ended up going to Stargazers, where Neeb went for a 4-gate Blink Stalker attack, and Kelazur decided to try and drop, and granted it's a short rush distance, this is kind of what happened. Neeb kills the Medivacs and Kelazur leaves the game. It was possibly the most straightforward game of StarCraft that happened in the EPT this week. Game 2 is where things get interesting as we headed on to Inside and Out, and Neeb going for a DT opening. Ends up getting some pretty decent damage despite it looking like Kelazur might shut it down pretty hard at first. Kelazur ends up gearing up for a big tank push that it frankly looks like Neeb should die to. But Neeb miraculously with some great micro manages to hold on, and then goes for a counterattack and proceeds to lose almost everything there. After that, there's some back and forth harassment. Kelazur discovers some weird bug with the map. Yes, I'm not joking. Apparently you can drop over here. But it kind of felt like Neeb was gradually getting further ahead with his tech, whereas Kelazur was a little bit slower to get up his big ghost transition. A fight breaks out that Neeb wins very one-sidedly, but at the same time, Kelazur has a double medevac drop, moving it on the opposite side of the map that does critical amounts of damage, sniping off all sorts of valuable tech units and buildings. Kelazur continues the pressure, and Neeb tries to hold it off with his disruptors, but at the end of the day, Kelazur has too much momentum and is able to take the game, tying up the series 1-1. Game 3, while having its interesting moments on Data C, ends up being a little bit more straightforward. Neeb ends up going for a Phoenix Colossus opening against Kelazur going for a 2-base tank push. Neeb ends up defending, gets a bit further ahead. Eventually, that ends up turning into a big old W on the board for Neeb, taking the series 2-1, putting him up against MaxPax in the semifinals, who just came off a victory versus Rainer's Protoss in a good old PvP. MaxPax is currently known as one of the best PvPers in the world right now, so I was pretty excited coming into this. Game 1, Neeb goes for a proxy robo, and MaxPax seems to just know it's coming every single step of the way. Has shield battery in the main base to deal with Warp Prism Stalker harass, has a shield battery and a Stargate already chrono boosting out a Void Ray over at the natural. He is just so prepared, and he shuts this down hard. Game 2, MaxPax goes for one of the wonkiest counters to an early expand I've seen, where he ends up throwing down a pylon and a bunch of shield batteries inside of Neeb's natural, traps in a bunch of units with Adept Shades, and somehow micros his way to victory. I honestly feel like I can't even explain this one. You just have to watch the clip and see it for yourself. But regardless of how he did it, MaxPax ended up defeating Neeb 2-0 and moved on to the grand finals. There he faced off versus Clem, who had come in off of victories versus Trigger, Hearthstone, and Lambo. Game 1 goes to Inside and Out, and MaxPax continues the trend of Protoss players loving opening up with Dark Templar on this map. The DTs do some moderate damage, killing off honestly more Marines than SCVs, but also losing the Warp Prism. MaxPax follows it up with some pretty successful Blink Stalker harassment, but Clem goes for a big 2-base push and ends up doing some pretty devastating damage. The rest of the game ended up just being Clem capitalizing on his advantage and eventually turning it into a W for game number 1. Game 2 headed on to Cosmic Sapphire, where MaxPax opened up with a Stargate for harassment, and Clem ended up doing a lot of Widowmine drops for harassment. The game escalated escalate into a macro game where both players had large late game armies, but also were continuing to do lots of damage with zealot run-bys as well as additional Widowmine drops. Eventually, it seemed like Clem was going to be able to seize the initiative with some sick micro to dodge disruptor shots, but MaxPax hits him in from behind with the zealot run-bys and the War Prism in the main base, does some pretty critical damage, and takes the game, tying up the series 1-1. Game 3 went on to Waterfall, where MaxPax ends up opening up with a 4-gate Blink Stalker opening, and Clem pretty much sees it coming. Despite that, MaxPax is able to pull off some phenomenal micro and turn this into a relatively even game. His transitions are a little bit slow behind it, but to be honest, so are Clem's at this point, as both players have invested a lot into just this Stalker aggression and defending it. The game eventually turns into yet another macro game, but finds itself in an odd spot as MaxPax and Clem both have their armies on opposite sides of the map from each other and decide to go base for base trading. Clem hits the bottom right-hand bases and starts sniping off Nexus one by one, whereas MaxPax goes up to the top left-hand base and finds a planetary fortress he actually has some trouble breaking. From this point on, Clem is able to seize a pretty substantial economic advantage, just having taken out some bases, whereas MaxPax couldn't, and forces MaxPax into a full-on base trade. Clem is already in an advantageous position though, and ends up rebuilding his infrastructure elsewhere, has mining whereas MaxPax doesn't, and eventually ends up taking the game. Game 4 heads on to Moondance with Clem at match point, and MaxPax decides to revert back to the good old 4-gate Blink Stalker aggression, whereas Clem decides to actually do some counter Widowmine drop harassment during the Blink Stalker aggression. The Widowmines do not accomplish a lot, and MaxPax pulls off some really great harassment and effectively takes the game off of it. And that brought us to a Game 5, the decider match to see who was going to be crowned the winner. This game, MaxPax decides to mix things up from the current meta of Protoss and actually goes for Psystorm. Clem discovers this as he hits a 3-base timing attack, and, well, let's just say he is probably not too thrilled about how the engagement went. MaxPax charges across the map, does some additional damage, and is nearly doubling the worker supply of Clem at this point, and eventually is able to turn that into a win, crowning him the winner of the EPT European Weekly number 131. That's it for this week, and thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed, do consider subscribing to the channel. Big thank you to Eric the Man 10 for supporting me on Ko-Fi, and I'll see you guys next week.